On behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's distinguished lecture. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Ambassador João Mino, the Consul General of Brazil in Chicago, for his presence and for his cooperation making this event possible. It's a special honor to introduce Governor Henrique Meirelles, President of the Central Bank of Brazil. Governor Meirelles came to public service after a long career in international banking, first in São Paulo and then in the United States. He was president of the Bank of Boston from 1996 through the merger in 1999 that created Fleet Boston Financial. And indeed, he's unusual for a Brazilian public servant in having had long work and also public service in the United States. He had extensive experience with institutions of higher education in the United States, serving as a board member or as a trustee at the Kennedy School at Harvard, at the Sloan School at MIT, at the Carroll School at Boston College, and also at the New England Conservatory of Music. He's also been an active philanthropist since his return to Brazil, especially active in promoting the revitalization of the historic center of the city of São Paulo. Upon returning to Brazil in 2002, Mr. Meirelles was elected federal deputy, but in 2003, he was called by then President-elect Luiz Inácio da Silva, President Lula, to direct the Central Bank of Brazil. In that office, Governor Meirelles has played a historic role in the monetary and fiscal stabilization of the Brazilian economy. Now, Governor Meirelles has been recognized as Brazilian of the Year in 2008, as Financier of the Year in 2008 also, as Central Banker of 2007 by Euromoney, and as Central Banker of the Americas by The Banker. And it's my pleasure and honor, on behalf of President Zimmer and the faculty of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, to recognize him as Distinguished Lecturer in Latin American Studies for 2010. Governor Meirelles will speak on perspectives for the Brazilian economy.
Well, thank you, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the Brazilian economy and Brazil nowadays and the perspectives for the next few years. I think that in order for us to take a look on the future, it's important to understand what has happened in the last years, because Brazil has gone through a history of frequent economic crisis, particularly after the LDC, which was called at that time the less developed countries credit crisis in the early 80s. Brazil had a long history of hyperinflation, current account crisis, foreign exchange crisis, fiscal, and evidently inflation. And during the first years of the stabilization and consolidation of the stabilization of the Brazilian economy during these last 8 years, it was frequent, the question that I've heard in speeches like these, in not only to the academia, but business, the press, all over the world, and people would ask me, well, Brazil is going well, but is it because the international environment is benign and Brazil is kind of sailing through a very benign environment during the last years? That we are talking about 4, 5, or 6. And what's going to happen when the first crisis happens? And then I would explain why I thought that it would be different, that Brazil was more resilient and so on and so forth. Well, the better way to test a case, hypothesis, to face the reality And we did do that. We had the 07-08 crisis, which was, for Brazil, in terms of direct lending, the cross-border lending to Brazil was the trigger, but at the end of the day, it was the worst foreign exchange crisis in Brazil in terms of flight of capital, which was the kind of crisis which had taken place in 02, in 98, and in some years before. It normally was the trigger for a recession. It was the trigger in 1982 for the so-called lost decade in Brazil. That time was a much bigger crisis in terms of sheer volume of capital flying, sheer volume of repatriation, sheer volume as a percentage of GDP, and so on and so forth. And Brazil did quite well. And the secret now is for us to understand why that happened and why we can look at the future the way I think we should. In terms to move forward, let's start with Brazil in 2003. Brazil had 60% of the total sovereign debt denominated in dollars. That meant that Brazil had a large external debt, and 40% of the domestic debt was linked to the dollar. This is what central bankers call the original sin, meaning a country which is not able to fund the sovereign only in its own currency, has to borrow in other people's currency. Brazil owed the IMF, was under an IMF agreement. Brazil owed about $30 billion to IMF, and we had to follow the agreement. Actually, I think it was a good thing, quite frankly, because the reforms which were done as a result of the IMF agreement in '99 and the year 2000 in Brazil proved to be quite good. Let me only finish it. Eu estou falando, desculpe. And let me turn. That's an important call, I can tell you. But I saw who was from where it was coming. Anyway, but you are more important anyway. The ratio, the public debt to GDP ratio was about 61%. Today, it's not that much different than some of the industrialized economies have even this or more, 70, 80. Some European countries, 100, 120, even more. But for a country like Brazil, it was a very high rate, very difficult to finance because of this lack of savings, small capital markets. Policy rate of the central bank, 25%. Rising inflation. Inflation on 12 months basis reached 17% in May of '03. And actually, it reached a peak of a running rate of about 30% in January. High risk premiums, unemployment at around 13%, minimum wage at $60. The approach was a very austere monetary policy and a strong fiscal adjustment. The fiscal adjustment was stronger than the one, for instance, that's being proposed now by Greece to adjust its economy. Very strong fiscal adjustment. Austere monetary policy. And the result was a quick disinflation. The annualized rate of inflation was about 30% in '03. It fell to 0 in July and then bounced back, but to about the target level where it stayed since then. Decrease in the public debt, decrease in sovereign debt exposure on foreign exchange, and as a result, decrease in country risk premiums. The cost, a drop in domestic demand, 15% of industrial output was redirected to export, generating trade surplus and a current account reversal. But Brazil began to accumulate reserves. We reached the bottom of $16 billion of reserves when we owed IMF substantial amounts higher than that. Brazil eventually, we prepaid IMF before the maturity of the agreement. We then eliminated the agreement with IMF. We prepaid all the restructured debt, the Paris Club, the Brady bonds, etc. And we paid all the domestically dollar-denominated debt. Today it's zero, and all the restructured debt is also zero. We, as a result of that, the external debt today, sovereign external debt, is about $80 billion, and reserves kept going up. We reached August of 2008, which was the days before the crisis hit Brazil, because crisis hit Brazil after Lehman Brothers failure in September of 2008. It had reached $205 billion, and in October 29 of 2010, it's about $285 billion. Actually, the last number is 286. The real interest rate has fallen during this period. This is the market rate, the 360 days market rate, and that's the rate above inflation, meaning that's the nominal rate, the market rate for 1 year discounted by the expected inflation. The red is the actual rate, and you see the ups and downs of monetary policy cycles. But the blue line is the trend. You can see the trend line is down. We don't know the trend line, obviously, where it's now. That's an assumption if the trend line were kept. But trend line is a concept. The only thing we know is the red line, where it is, where it was. The trend line is not an actual number, and that doesn't mean nothing more than, well, the trend line is down. We know that. But the actual line is the red one. The public sector net debt is falling, as you can see. And as I said, it was a strong fiscal adjustment, has fallen strongly in the first year, almost 6% of GDP in 1 year. That's a very strong adjustment. And then 50, 48, et cetera, and we hit the crisis with 42.7. And here, it's a very interesting point that I would like to show to you, is this fact that when we got to the crisis in August 2008, in lighter blue, the debt to GDP ratio was 42.7%. And during this 4 months of the crisis in 2008, the debt to GDP ratio fell 4% of GDP. The question is, how come? How could that have happened? The very simple reason, because the sovereign is a net creditor and sovereign in foreign currency. The international reserves were $200 billion, and the sovereign owed only 80 in foreign currency. That means that the net reserve was about 120-ish, and when there was the crisis, there was a depreciation of the local currency, the real. As a result, the value of the reserves in real went up, bringing the net debt level down. That's so-called automatic stabilizer. and meaning that one of the reasons why Brazil was able to get out of this crisis so fast and so effectively. But not only that, because reserves enabled the country to lend dollars to corporations, banks, exporters. We had a solid banking system because of the lessons learned during the crisis in the 80s and 90s. The Brazilian banking system was well capitalized, and the prudential rules set by central bank are very rigorous in Brazil as a result of all the past. That enabled the financial system to face the crisis in a better situation. And central bank also held liquidity mandatorily placed by banks at the central bank, the compulsory reserves, which are a liquidity cushion, which proved to be essential during the crisis because that enabled the central bank to release reserves in reais as well. We had reserves in dollars and reserves in reais to solve the problems of the banks. The difference is that reserves in dollars is owned by the central bank. And the reserves in reais is placed at central banks owned by the banks, the private banks and public banks, the commercial banks. And that enabled the central bank to release the reserves. And that proved to be very effective. The markets which had almost gone to a stop, the liquidity, the credit went down, as it happened in many countries, particularly in the US, but we were able to restore the normality in the markets in a very short period of time. Question of few months, the credit market was back to normal. And we are also able to act very decisively in the futures markets because, again, we also had built a position there preparing the country for the crisis. The lessons then here is the reason why I felt confident when people asked me the question what it would happen when first crisis hit Brazil is because we had the defenses. We had all the right defenses in place. We had cash in dollars, in reais. The debt to GDP level had come down. The financial system was in good health. The prudential rules were strong. Credit portfolios were prepared. Why? Because we had experience with crisis, obviously. Let me, where is, it's better. Let's move to the direct one. And here it's an indication of the how the level of the external debt netted of reserves came down. Brazil, then, for instance, here I am talking about the country, not only about the sovereign. The net sovereign debt down, that minus 48 at the end means that the reserves are about $50 billion higher than the total external debt of Brazil. But when that was decreasing, at the same time, the credit rating of Brazil was improving. Then Brazil embarked on what I call a virtuous circle. Inflation targeting very rigorously applied. That brought macroeconomic stability and predictability in the economy. That lowered the inflationary risk. A floating exchange rate with building up of reserves as a result of declining net foreign debt reduced the external risk. Primary surplus of the budget. The government has a target to have a surplus before the payment of interest. That's called the primary surplus. There was a decline in public debt that lowered the fiscal risk. That lowered the risk premium. There is, as a result, a reduction in interest rate with more credibility. because the predictability is higher, the risk is lower. That amplifies the effect because the moment that the interest rate comes down, as I showed, the interest rate paid by Treasury to roll over the debt comes down. That helps to lower the debt. That helps the whole process. Then macroeconomic fundamentals sound, combined with adequate prudential policy and tight bank supervision, prudential rules and bank supervision, international reserves result in a better capacity to absorb internal and external shocks, macroeconomic and financial stability, sustainable growth, credit and capital market development, and investment growth. Another very interesting point that the case of Brazil made it very clear for emerging economies is that the moment that the country risk comes down and the predictability of the economy increases, now I am talking to business people directly, the moment that the predictability increases, the planning horizon of corporations increases. The moment that the planning horizon of corporation increases, one is able to approve projects which have a lower rate of return because you have a longer planning horizon. If you work with too short the planning horizon, you need a very high rate of return to pay back the investment. And that means that the level of investment in the country has grown substantially throughout this period. As a result of that, the credit in the total credit in the country keeps growing. In red, the total credit as a percent of GDP. In blue, the total credit in reais. You can see how it increased as a result of stability, predictability, better fundamentals. And that answers some of these questions which are under heavy debate today, which is what is the cost for better, stronger prudential rules? We know that. The question is, what is the benefit? What can the country and corporations and banks gain from that? And Brazil is a very good case that there is a very substantial gain in the sense that you have more investment, more predictability. The likelihood of crisis come down. Longer credit horizon, bank credit liners, average tenure for consumer and corporate, how it's going up steadily. Increased access to bank credit, outstanding credit operations over 5,000 reais, millions of borrowers, how it's going up. For those who might be slightly worried, well, this idea of credit growth sometimes may bring problems. As we know here in the US, that's correct. But everything in life is a balance. As one physician has told me once, that the difference between the medicine and the poison is the measure. It's how much one takes. And 46% of GDP is still very low by international standards. US is 200, and most of the Asians are more than 100, etc. We still have room to grow. It's healthier to grow to some point. Increased access to bank credit, as I said. Capital markets, primary issues. In a market which is unpredictable, the capital market can't flourish. You can see how it went up, how it came down during the crisis, 08, 09, and how it jumped in 010, particularly stocks, which was unheard of in Brazil. companies that now are being able to fund themselves in the stock market, which was not the case. In Brazil, for a long period, Brazilian corporations, to grow, had to rely on retained earnings or short-term credit. Now the credit is more reasonable, is available, and stock is already becoming even an international bank. Beginning of the year had made the option that they needed to increase the capital for their Brazilian subsidiary rather than issuing stock to raise capital, about $10 billion at the head office. They opted to do that in Brazil. The subsidiary had an IPO done in Brazil and raised in Brazil $10 billion. That is how the environment is changing. Net foreign direct investment going up steadily. You see the green line, that's the average fell during in 2009 during the crisis, but it's up, and the green line is the market forecast for the future. The World Bank, actually there is the World Bank as well, but this is the UNCTAD survey on the favorite host economy for foreign direct investments for the 2010 to 2012 period. We can see that it's China in the first place, India, Brazil, very close to India, and United States, just in the fourth place. Then Russia, Mexico, United Kingdom, etc. And that's a remarkable improvement for Brazil, because we are talking here about very large volumes and large economies. Brazilian external liabilities, that's a very interesting concept. In blue, it was the percentage of the external liabilities of total foreign investment in Brazil, which were fixed income in a way or another. Debt over gross external liabilities. You see that it's coming down from 31 to 17 around, and how the risk capital, foreign direct investment, plus stocks is going up. Then the majority of the external foreign investment in Brazil is in a way or another stock, either directly in your subsidiary or in the stock market. That's a substantial change. Exports, how it's growing throughout these last years, and after 2010, obviously, is the market projection, market forecast. Export diversification, the numbers, the lines speak by themselves. You can see the blue line is Asia, Latin America green, Europe yellow, United States red. I think that it's natural to expect that the U.S. recovers because this drop from 2007 to now, it was a result of the crisis, but evidently it was declining before. And I think that an effort should be made by the two countries to increase that. But that's the Brazilian exports anyway. That's an effort that should be made basically by Brazil to export more to the U.S. But the U.S. export to Brazil as well are also declining throughout the many years. Has increased during the last months. But anyway, the real payroll growth, it's in blue, that's the total payroll in the country, total salaries and benefits paid to workers in the country. You can see how it's moving up in real terms, and how the inflation comes down helps, because one part of the real payroll growth is stable inflation, because high inflation erodes the real purchase power. Formal job creation. Now that's an important number. Brazil was creating in the late 90s about 117,000 new jobs per year in Brazil, formal. From year 2000 to 2002, the average was 668. This average went up to 1,003,25, 04, 05, 06. This average went up. It fell during 09. Obviously, Brazil lost 800,000 jobs during the crisis, the 4 or 5 months of the crisis. But it began to recover already in February. It lost jobs in November, December, January, and then began to recover in February. And has created 1.2 million new jobs in 09 after the February. In the year 2010, from January to September only, 2.2 million. I neglected to say that those numbers are only from January to September, exactly to make it consistent with 2010. But that means the strength of the recovery in Brazil after the crisis, 2.2 million new jobs. 14.7 million jobs created since 2003. Unemployment rate in Brazil. As I said, it was 13% in 2003. The trend line is green. Now it's below the trend, you see. 6.4%, seasonally adjusted in September 2010. Lowest ever, by far. Never got that low. Meaning the economy is strong. Unemployment rate in Brazil compared to many other countries, you can see countries with more than 20 and all the way down, and now Brazil is 6.4, meaning Brazil now is in a particularly positive moment. Retail sales, if you take a look on what happened, it declined in the beginning of 2003, as I said in the beginning, with the adjustment, but from July 2003 on, it went up. Some ups and downs, The broad retail sales is the one which includes car, trucks, tractors, and etc. And retail sales is everything else. In 2009, you can see that late 2009, end of 2008, early 2009, you can see how the blue line fell. That was basically the car sales, which went down as a result of the crisis because of the credit problems, but how it rebounded quite sharply. You can see this, the ups and downs in the blue after the crisis. The reason is fiscal stimulus. There was fiscal stimulus which would be withdrawn periodically. Now it's gone. And the last month of the fiscal stimulus, the sales would go up. The first month after that would go down, then, etc. But now it's over because the fiscal stimulus is gone. It was a withdrawal of the value-added tax in the cars, which are substantial in Brazil. If you take now GDP growth, you can see red, the average 2.1 from 1999 to 2002, 3.3 from 2003 to 2005, 5.1 from 2006 to 2008, minus 0.2 in 2009, 7.3 forecast for this year. The market actually is 5.5, the market consensus. That 7.3 is central bank's forecast. Performance before and after the crisis, that's Brazil in red, and in blue, emerging economies excluding Brazil itself, India, and China. Because India and China have different dynamics because of demographics, etc., and other factors. But if we exclude those three, that's almost all the BRICS are those three plus Russia. But if you If you exclude those, you see that Brazil is growing higher than the average emerging. Now, if you take a look on GDP per capita growth throughout these years, you can see that there was a 17.5% real growth. Per capita income growing, and then you can see since the 60s, it went up quickly for 10 years. In the 70s, then it fell because Brazil had borrowed heavily in order to fund that growth. Fell and then began to come up. Income inequality reduction, you can see how it's evolving steadily. Middle class growth and poverty reduction. From 2003 to 2009, 36 million people have entered the middle class in Brazil. 21 have crossed the poverty line up. If the present trend is kept, 36 million more will enter the middle class, and more 14 will cross the poverty line. The family grant program also helped in terms of reducing the people in extreme poverty from 12% to the 4% level now, and that trend is down. If you take a look on social mobility, classes A and B, light blue on top, you can see how it's evolving. Middle class, class C, how it's evolving. Number of people from 66 in 2003, projections 113 in 2014. This D is according to the income level, how is dropping, and what's really dropping is the level E, which is lowest, from 50%, 50 million to 16 million people going down. Homes with personal computers and access to internet, percentage of the households as it's growing, and it's growing at a fast pace. Availability of arable land, to give you an idea about the potential for commodities, production, and so on. So in Brazil, Brazil is already one of the largest commodity exporters, and that does not obviously take into consideration all the protected areas, the Amazon, etc. Rainforest is not considered. That's only the savannas and the arable lands. If you think about long-term decades, we have the past, the crises, and the problems that Brazil faced. We had the so-called problems during the 80s. Then the last decade was a decade of rebuilding. But if we look at the future, I would say that we have to think about increase of saving in investment level and raising of productivity. If we think about agenda for the next years, as I said, level of domestic savings, quality of public expenditures, investment rate, and infrastructure, simplification of the tax system, legal environment more favorable to business, and incentive to long-term investment. The final message before we talk and dialogue, to dialogue, is that the good news for Brazil is that last chart that I present for many audience today is the one who calls more attention today. People are now interested in discussing the agenda for the future in Brazil, long-term future for Brazil. 10 years in Brazil was always long term, or even 20 or so. In Brazil, a few years ago, when I came to a meeting like this, people would be asking me about the crisis, about how to get out of the crisis, how to avoid the crisis, and discussion, and how about inflation next 3 months. I mean, the conversation never went beyond 1 year. And now, evidently, the country has the conditions to talk and think in a longer term. Well, that's the first part. Thank you very much for the attention. We've learned analyzing crisis throughout many decades. When we took over in Brazil, we did that. The most important lesson is you have to determine what is the most critical problem, which is generating the constraints for growth in a particular economy, and address forcefully those problems specifically. In the case of Brazil, it was basically, at the end of the day, the public finances. The state was creating the instability. I mean, the households were not over-leveraged, the corporations were not over-leveraged, the banking system was sound. The problem was basically the high level of the sovereign debt, the dependence on external capital, and the low level of international reserves and the insecurity with that brought. The currency was no convertible, and so on and so forth. And then we address those items. And I think that you have to face the constraints that every country has. The case of the US, I think what's being done is quite clear. The moment that there is no conditions to provide the extra fiscal stimulus for a variety of reasons, and then the Fed is doing, I think, what it could do, which is rely on monetary policy. And since the base rate is already very low, it has to take bolder measures, and basically this is what the Fed is doing.
I'll repeat the question, but I'll summarize it. This is with regard to comparison with the experience of Indonesia and the Central Bank of Indonesia in inflation targeting strategies. The Indonesian experience has suggested that there are structural as well as monetary factors in inflation. And the question is whether in Brazil, some of the roots of inflation were structural rather than simply monetary.
There were many causes which were structural in Brazil. Some of the same questions you raised: infrastructure, logistics, costs, and so on and so forth. And evidently, some of the modernization helped, like in the telecommunications, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I think that we differentiated what is the cost level, what we call the Brazil's cost, differentiate that from inflation. The fact that, at least in the Brazilian experience, some areas have high cost does not mean that that cost has to be raising. One thing is the level of cost. The other thing is the rate of increase. And the moment that you break the inflationary expectation and you control the aggregate demand and you really have a credible inflation target, at least in Brazil, that helped to bring all of that process of indexation and backward-looking inflation down. And it was there were moments of stalemate. To give an idea, when we adopted the policy since the beginning, inflation in Brazil was running at a high rate, and there was a kind of consensus, common wisdom, saying that inflation in Brazil cannot ever be below 8%, 7%. Economists would publish numbers, developed series showing that. And because of all those reasons. And we adopted a very strong monetary policy in the early '03. And then the economy came to a halt. And corporations began to face pressure. And one day I had a meeting with 50 CEOs of corporations. And they were complaining bitterly. And one of them told me, Henrique, you are going to create a very serious crisis in Brazil. For instance, I am not selling this month. It was April. I'm not selling because my inventory cost is higher than the price that I am able to sell. I said, it's quite simple. You mispriced. And that's, I'll tell you what to do. When there was the result of the last election, you thought, I know the person, obviously. I had been a banker in Brazil for many years. I knew everyone. Said, look, you thought that President Lula would adopt a loose monetary policy and a loose fiscal policy. You bet on price increases and inflation going up. You and many others. You accepted contracts with higher inflation, but setting the price. You thought that you would be better off accepting a high increase, but setting the price for 1 year. And you had a whole structure being built, and then your inventory proved to be too expensive. You have to simply accept your loss. You made a mistake, a planning mistake. Accept that, cut the price of inventory, move forward, and plan for the reality which is prevailing. And I said, I know what you are doing. You are trying, you and all the others here, and many of the other people talking in the press, they are trying to, at the end of the day, press the central bank to lose the monetary policy in order to allow for the inflation to come up and at the end of sanction your price system. And many other. We will not get out of this if I did that. We will not do that. And then the next month, in May, when the Monetary Policy Committee met, the headline of a very important newspaper said, the Monetary Policy Committee meeting in Brazil is called Copom. Copom meets under brutal pressure. Headline, front page. The next day, Copom resisted the pressure. What happened? The inflation expectation nosedived that day on. And then all that structure began to change. Not necessarily the cost level. The cost level demands more time, investment, and productivity. But inflation expectation came down, and the inflation rate, which was running about 1.5% per month, 1.2, was 0 in July. And then bounced back to the inflation level. But again, that broke the persistence of inflation. But it was not that easy, because there were also other things more structural. Contracts, long-term. Utilities in Brazil had which had come through a privatization, had long-term contracts, indexed the prices to the past inflation. We have that still, but it's coming down slowly. All the rentals in Brazil are indexed to the past inflation. Even salary negotiation by unions, normally informally they demand the past inflation. I mean, all of that exists. That's the reason why the inflation target in Brazil is 4.5% rather than the 2%, which prevails in many countries. But that's coming down. And as longer inflation stays on target, all that pressure comes down and down and down and down. And then you have more investment, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you address the other problem, which is the cost level. It's a long answer, but I think that it summarized a very important question in terms of monetary policy for emerging economies.
So the question is, once again, even asking for a commentary on policy in the United States, whether one concern of creditors or one concern of people about national debt is that the government will be tempted to use inflation to inflate it away.
Yeah. Evidently, those are the two kinds of risks that are related to this question. I mentioned that one, it was what I call the inflationary risk, is the one you are addressing. The other one, as I call the fiscal risk, that's the risk of default. There are two ways that countries which have excessive debt can do, besides austerity, besides lowering the debt level gradually. But what creditors normally would be afraid is, number one, inflating the debt, trying to at least. Number two, straightforward default, restructuring. And in the case of Brazil, for instance, Brazil had done both even during the 80s. And the problem is, after a while, it doesn't work anymore, because everyone is running against inflation. You don't fool people anymore, or creditors. To give an idea, during the peak of the hyperinflation in Brazil, I was a banker in Brazil. At the bank I ran, the average tenure of the portfolio, the loans, my loan portfolio had an average period of 60 days. If inflation went up, there would be no time. We'd be collecting before that. Everything was like that. For instance, if you got to a supermarket some days, suddenly out of the blue there were huge lines. The next day it was empty. Why was that? That was the last day, or the first day actually it was the other way around. The last day of the period when you would buy and have to pay the bill. And the last day would mean that you'd pay the bill in a few days. Then no one would buy. But the next day, it was the first day of the next round. You'd pay the bill 1 month after that. Then everyone would buy to take advantage of inflation. When everyone is in that game, the governments can't win. And that's one of the advantages of Brazil, because Brazil experienced it all. And then we now know that the way to go is the right way. I think that that's the most important lesson. Brazil did all of that, is doing extremely well, and the president has an 83% of approval rate in the polls.
The question is, would you address the issue of interest rates in Brazil, and what sort of long-term changes would be necessary to bring them down in the long run?
I think it's very simple. That's my answer. No one, it's not everyone would agree with that. But my answer is that simply Brazil should keep doing what it's doing. In summary, you keep inflation on target, you keep decreasing the debt to GDP level, you keep the financial system in good health, you don't increase too much leverage, and the level of risk premium comes down. As a result of that, the interest rate comes down steadily, as it's happening during the last years. But that was a discussion during the last days in Brazil. But again, that is the way to proceed from, because that's the way it has worked so far in Brazil.
I think the question is, assuming that people bought and held real estate as a kind of hedge against inflation or as a preferred investment, if inflation comes down, will people disinvest in real estate, and should real estate prices come down?
Well, I think the people who are buying real estate as a hedge against inflation basically until the mid-90s. After that, the first stabilization plan, which was the Real Plan in 1994, brought inflation down for the first time. Because then it was when it came to 2000 to one-digit level, we saw that it came up again, but in a different level than before. Then that effect has already happened. Now what is happening is real estate prices actually are increasing somewhat, more in some areas, less than others, but that's a result of purchase power, more demand for households, from households and companies, for offices and factories and plants. In summary, straightforward supply and demand.
So I'll repeat the question. The question is, with the election of Dilma to the presidency, there's been some hints of banks raising the interest rates. This is in response to a report in Globo that there's a transition cabinet meeting, is that correct, of Dilma's transition cabinet, which has already discussed changes in economic policy and specifically
the real dollar exchange rate?
No, the transition team was selected this week, which is going to basically process the transition, to organize the transition with the present administration. And the transition team, it's not planning or developing macroeconomic policy at this point. Evidently, after the new cabinet is appointed and the new key officials are appointed, then if there is any change, it's going to be announced. But then the president has already announced, the president-elected has already announced that she will keep the present set of macroeconomic policies, with meaning inflation target regime, free-floating foreign exchange regime, and declining debt to GDP ratio for the sovereign debt.
How, as the Brazilian economy grows and as the Brazilian social safety net is increased, could Brazil avoid the situation of Europe and the United States, fiscal crisis due to obligations of the social safety net?
Okay. Evidently, that is a challenge for every country. And the secret here is to manage well the statistics, the actuarial numbers in terms of the contributions and etc. versus the future liabilities and all of that. But again, that is an ongoing concern for everyone. If you take a look on what's happening now and the projections for the next years, even the market projections for the debt to GDP level is to keep coming now. Because there is a commitment to keep the primary surplus of the budget for the next years and so on and so forth. But again, only to finalize, people would ask me, what can go wrong? Can it go wrong? Is it possible? Could it go wrong? Answer is obviously yes. Every country can do wrong things, can over-leverage, can spend too much, over-consume, and that's a question of time. It takes some years, but you get yourself into trouble. No doubt about it. That happens to persons, to corporations, and to countries. I think that is an ongoing proposition, concern, challenge to keep things to the right direction. One of the things that I feel confident about Brazil, is something that I mentioned briefly, is the fact that in Brazil, for many, many years, there was this debate whether the cost of stabilizing the economy were not too high. And Brazil's government should spend and try to do difficult other things, not to pay the debt, do this because of the social needs and so on and so forth. The moment that adopted a consistent policy for a period long enough that the benefits became apparent, now it has popular support. As I said, the president has 83% approval rate in the government. And after 8 years of a consistent policy, in the sense that with all of that, I think today there is political support and social support for rational and sustainable policy. Evidently, there is always the risk, there is always the possibility, but again, that's a challenge for all of us that are participating in the debate to give our contribution for that not to happen. And again, and one country learning from the others and learning from crises and so on and so forth. I think that in that regard, I think all of us keep learning and hopefully will not repeat the same mistakes. Thank you.